Hello, everybody. We are back for our latest episode of Boardroom RevOps, where we're bringing you valuable tips from RevOps experts so you can make it to the C-suite. I'm James, the co-founder of Account Aim, the RevOps BI platform. Super excited to have Drew Bernstein with me today. Drew has a background in sales ops, and for the last 6 years or so, he has led go-to-market, value creation, and portfolio ops at a number of PE firms. Thanks for joining me today, Drew.
Thanks for having me, James. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, I mean, you're kind of in a unique position because you've seen like RevOps from so many perspectives. Like, obviously, you started in sales ops, RevOps. You've hired a bunch of folks in RevOps at all of your portfolio companies. You come in and I think given a lot of like guidance as well. So I'm super curious to hear kind of your perspectives from, I was going to say outside, but maybe semi inside outside view. Such a unique role, which we'll get into. But before we do you want to kind of just share your quick background for folks?
Yeah, sure. So I've kind of been in the RevOps ecosystem for the better part of my career, probably before revenue operations was even revenue operations. Had an opportunity to, operate and work for a Vista-backed portfolio company and, really learn, from them and some of their best practices and get my arms around that go-to-market playbook. And from there, had the opportunity to work in value creation team type roles for a Riverside company and got to stand up a handful of revenue operation functions across that portfolio, then go over to LLR and be part of their go-to-market value creation team. And then most recently, Next Equity as their go-to-market operating partner. Definitely I've seen a lot and, it's been an eventful and enjoyable ride.
Yeah. Tell me more like what is value creation for folks that don't know?
Yeah. But I like to think of value creation. It's a little bit of insurance, but it's also like having a consulting firm at your disposal. I think the best way is you have these funds and GPs and LPs who invest so much money into these companies. And, how do you really look to protect that investment and to accelerate that investment? I think the role of the value creation team is there to do just that. It's to be a partner for both the deal teams as well as the portfolio companies and really look to be that value added partner that helps them go through this process in a way that's collaborative and ultimately very efficient and effective.
That's great. And how did you kind of land that from a career perspective? I'm actually hearing anecdotally, like more and more folks ask me about, what does it look like to go do portfolio ops from like a RevOps perspective, and how do I land there? So, what was your kind of experience?
Yeah, so I got into it very early, and again, before it was probably even a term that was being used. I had an opportunity to work for a small private equity firm in Orlando, and I heard about all the challenges and pain points within the portfolio, and there really weren't the resources to go and help them. And I said, "Hey, to me, like this is an opportunity for me to really lean in and show, leverage my consulting background and be that resource and help to break down the barriers between the private equity firm and the portfolio company." And from there, really got my hands dirty and, kind of learned the challenges and pain points and, what some of those key initiatives are that are really going to make the difference in a successful investment or not. And then I got back into consulting and, very quickly realized that I wanted to get back on that private equity side. And to me, I thought a great opportunity was to operate underneath a Vista-backed company and, really learn from one of the early adopters in that value creation space. So I was, I would say I was very focused on that career journey and, made those career decisions that I thought positioned me to ultimately get there. But I'll tell you, it's a field that so many people are trying to get into. I probably get 2 or 3 LinkedIn messages, a week about, "Hey, like, love to hear your career and how you got here and, just your thoughts." And, there's so much talent out there right now. It's just great to see this continuing to be an emerging field that people are trying to get into.
Yeah, and I do think kind of similar to your experience, like if you can't get into value creation portfolio ops directly, a great playbook for your own career is to go join a PE-backed company and do a really good job on the RevOps side, because I think folks like you on the value creation side, folks even at the board level to some extent, like actually start to recognize good talent when things are run really well. So if you go into a PE-backed company and crush it, I think it's maybe a good way to then, maybe get an invite onto the portfolio ops team. I'm curious if you agree.
Yeah, 100%, and I've seen it. And, there's one of my former revenue operations director, Chris Rulick, he's at Riverside. When I kind of found out that he was trying to make that, move from, operating into the value creation side, like to me, I was like, oh, this is a home run opportunity for him. And, to see him kind of move into that position and be so successful, is something I take a lot of pride in. The same time, being able to put a couple other people in that seat and help them transition from operator into value creation. I think it's a great path. I think the partnership between the value creation team and revenue operations directors or VPs of revenue operations, it's so tight. You work so collaboratively. Like, it's a great opportunity to bridge that gap if that's what you're trying to do.
Yeah, for sure. And tell me, where does RevOps work and value creation work kind of stop and start together? Is it like, and I'm actually going to tie this in with just like my perspective. You mentioned like starting in Vista Equity was great. You mentioned a playbook. For those not familiar, like Vista is really well known as like, buying a software company and just having a specific playbook on like how do we go optimize go to market, and RevOps too. That was really successful for them. And I think they kind of kicked off a lot of this value creation work to some extent in the software space. But yeah, tell me more. Like, is it like you guys, I'm sure it depends on the fund, but you have a playbook, you're then just going to go counsel the folks in the seat of the company, and you guys are kind of like like
Yeah. Great
mentor and like
question.
guidance, or
It looks different at every single, probably private equity fund, and it also looks different with probably every single portfolio company. And it's based
sure.
on what the organization needs. If they don't have a revenue operation function, it looks a lot different. Like really trying to build out what that looks like and creating that right foundation to build off of. Now, when you have a company that has a great foundation and the right people and processes in place, it's like, how do you pour more fuel to that fire?
Mm,
And then, how does that work between like the RevOps and the value creation team? You know, it really depends. It's a two-way street. So, again, I can offer advice, I can roll up my sleeves, I can be a resource, like, but you also have to want to work and, work with us too. And I think where I've had the most success is, partnering with those revenue operations people like, like who want to learn and who want to be a partner and who want to collaborate. And at the same time, I'm learning from them every single day too. I think one of the best parts about this role is, when you take a major project or initiative that a RevOps director or VP of RevOps may do one time a year, I'm probably doing it 15 to 20 times a year. So I'm getting a lot of those reps, but I'm also picking up on like, what are those one or two things that like I really thought worked well here and trying to bridge that into the next one? Or like, what are the two things that didn't work great here and trying to avoid those things and, continuing to learn and enhance that program. And, I don't come in thinking I have all the answers. I'm learning and kind of working with them and trying to educate and enable at every step along the way too.
yeah, that's awesome. I think that's really well painted about why it's such an attractive role. But let's dive into it then, around like your perspective from value creation, like looking into RevOps. Like, what are you guys looking for out of the function as a whole within the portfolio companies? Like, what do you want from like a good RevOps team?
Yeah, I think again this has evolved so much over the years. When at one point it was just around getting the systems and structures in place, now it's like a great thing to have. If I look at where that benchmark is today, it's so much higher. When we think about when I'm helping to interview revenue operations leaders or, working with them, like when I'm saying that bar, it's we want them to be a thought leader. We want them to be a partner to the C-suite team. We want them to be able to really own and be accountable for so much inside of that go-to-market function and allowing the VPs of sales to focus on the opportunities and allowing the CROs to focus on the strategic, go-to-market vision. So, we obviously want them to not just present the data, we want them to understand the data and,
Mm,
drive insights and be able to present those insights in digestible ways. And again, I think the other thing we're really looking for out of that function is not to be reactive.
mm,
So much that function historically been on assessing lagging indicators. And I think the shift now is, we look to them to be proactive of, trends, what's out there, how do we drive more efficiency, what opportunities are out there. Like we look to these top revenue operations leaders to really facilitate and drive a lot of those conversations.
yeah, that tracks. I mean, a lot of that is a thesis for why we started accounting. RevOps is becoming more strategic. It has to be to do so. You have to take control of the data and be forward looking. So great to hear that you're seeing that as well. I want to double click into a few of those things you mentioned, which I think were all really great. You mentioned ownership to start. Like, tell me more. Like, what does it mean to take ownership from a RevOps perspective? It's kind of a really broad role. Like, we're talking about like specific like jobs to be done. Like, what does ownership look like to you?
Yeah, it's tough, and I empathize for all revenue operations leaders out there, and I've sat in that seat as well. I think when you talk about ownership and accountability, I go back to something one of the first CROs I worked very closely with told me is having a very high say-do ratio. So when I think about ownership, if you say you're going to do something, go out there and do it. And there's so much that you can do in revenue operations. You know, it can sometimes be, that could be an issue in itself. So I think really wrapping your arms around, like, what are these key initiatives? What is going to move the needle? What are those things that we need to be fundamentally sound on to really be able to continue to accelerate this journey? And then you have to drive alignment about what those things are and get that right level of buy-in. Just because I believe that's what we should be doing, and doesn't mean that's what the CRO should thinks that we should be doing, or the CFO or the CEO. So really making sure that everybody is very much aware of these are the things that we need to get right, owning those and taking accountability for them, and just ensuring they get done.
Yeah.
And I think about some of the best sales ops and RevOps leaders I work with. I'm just continuously impressed with just their ability to get things done, and block out the noise, block out the distractions, the ad hoc requests, and those key things that are, ultimately table stakes to being successful. They find a way to get it done consistently.
What have you seen? I think you hit on like a really challenging part of the job where there's so much going on, so much ad hoc for a laundry list of things to do. You said the best RevOps leaders can identify what is most important for the business and then importantly drive alignment so other people agree and let them focus on those things. Like, what are the tactics you've seen folks do to drive that alignment? 'Cause I think it's a really hard part of the job.
I don't know if it's a tactic, but I would say more of a skill set. Extremely strong communicators. They are not, they're kind of not hiding behind their computer. They're proactive. If you get them for 5 minutes, they're going to give you the punchline and they're going to tell you what's happening and why that is. And it doesn't have to be a 30-minute or a 2-hour conversation. When they're sending you the materials or sending you an email, like, it's tight. Um, and I think a lot of that plays into it because when there's so much communication and so much noise, and like, to be able to just know, like, I'm going to get the headline, I'm going to get what I need to know, and you have that right level of confidence from that team that they trust you. I think that is a huge element to it.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think a common mistake folks make is that RevOps is such a data-driven, detail-oriented job. Some folks can't help but just kind of lay out all the detail they've been working on. And like, you don't need to do that. It's, something you can maybe do as a junior, but it's not going to make it at the senior
Well, I
level.
think with the data thing, everybody wants to be data driven, but there's so much data out there,
Yeah.
and you could spend all day in the data. But to come in with a hypothesis of, hey, this is what I want to look at, and here's the data that I need for that. And this is like, am I going to validate or not validate my hypothesis? And I think when you can go in with that approach versus, I need to try to solve everything for everybody, and you're looking at so much data, you end up, like, by the time you get to that data and answer and get the right consensus on that, whatever's happening, a lot of times it's too late. So the ability to move quick and move swiftly and, like, have that very high business IQ of why I think this is happening, so you're not trying to boil the ocean, is super important.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You also mentioned in the past, like, the importance of, doing some of the behind the scenes work to get people kind of on the same page from a narrative perspective when you're communicating. Maybe it's, an executive meeting pre-board deck. Tell me more about that because I think that's actually not a super obvious thing for some folks. Like, how are folks utilizing that skill set?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's so missed. And I'd say I'm going to shout out a guy named Mike Levine at Easy Metrics. This is probably nobody better than him, and I've probably learned a lot of this from him over the last 2 years. But what I loved about his approach to this was, he would look to get like, when he was presenting information, it wasn't the first time people were hearing about this information. He was testing and validating along the way. And he was, having the conversations and having people challenge and push back. And all of those things, when he would do his analysis, would just make it so much tighter. And what this did was, you know, we didn't wait for a month for him to present. And then you get all these questions and feedback. And then he has to go back and present, look it all over again, come back in another 2 weeks to present. So when he got to that point, it was almost a validation exercise at that time of presentation. And how do you do that? Like, it's a skill, and it's IQ, it's EQ, it's because you're telling some people they might not be doing things the right way. And you're saying, hey, some things are maybe not going to plan. And like, how do you do that in a way that, it's not a me versus you thing, but this is an us versus our initiative type of effort. And, you have to have the trust and credibility and, like that's something that's earned. And, Michael's always one to be able to earn that. And just, his track record there is just so impressive. Like, I found that so impressive when, like, ever there was something to present, everybody was already up to speed with kind of what the presentation was. And it was like, let's get behind this now. And it's, or like kind of poke any little minor holes, but it wasn't like a reset.
Yeah, that's really great. It's like working out the kinks along the way, just like getting buy-in ahead of time ultimately, right?
Yeah. And so tough because, like, there's so much data out there and there's so much inconsistency with the data from time to
Yeah.
time. And like, oh, like this is probably not right because of this. Like, well, we could have figured that out 2 weeks ago if we would have just continued to communicate along the way of what we were trying to do. And, not look at as much as like these like big milestones, but like, how do we win every single week? How do we win every single day? And I think, him and there's so many other people out there, like I've kind of picked that up, that skill set up from. But it's it's so valuable.
Yeah, that's great. I think the biggest pothole in some of those like big meetings or data exercises is getting stuck debating the definition of a metric. So aligning metrics and having run through this with people beforehand is super important. Cool. The
And
last
to
thing
that
you
point, I think that consistency is really important too, because when you
yeah.
are consistently changing, your retention definition or this definition, like your MQL definition, like it's hard to make decisions. And I think that's again where a RevOps person can, come in and say, hey, like, it's not about hitting this number, it's about hitting this right, like this right criteria and consistently keeping that metric so you're able to evaluate it.
Yeah. Last thing I wanted to cover from your original answer on like how you guys kind of evaluate and think of like a good RevOps team is the proactivity piece. So I think you've covered this kind of like tangentially in some of the responses so far, but tell me more here. Like how can RevOps add predictability to the business? Yeah, what are you looking for on the proactivity side of things?
Yeah, I think right now too in this AI age, there's so much more opportunity to do this, but there's also so much more risk in doing it as well. There's so many AI tools out there, and you can throw in all that data. Like, how much are you going to trust that data, and how accurate is it, and all those challenges. But I think it's consistently looking at where are we trying to go, and are we on path to get there. And if you kind of work backwards from that, you get to more proactiveness of like, okay, like, if we're really trying to do this, are we doing these 4 or 5 things well? And those 4 or 5 things well, like, might not be in the numbers yet. And that's where, that RevOps individual or, like in that like really tight go to market organization is they can be more proactive because they're looking at those things. They know the levers that are ultimately impacting results. And sometimes those levers aren't numbers. They could be, listening to discovery calls. They could be looking at the quality of the MQLs. Like, but you can't be proactive across everything. So again, it's being able to drill into those most important things. And that's where from a really strong RevOps person, they're able to prioritize where do I spend my time, my energy, my efforts. Because if you're working for a PE backed mid-market, lower mid-market portfolio, like I would be shocked if your RevOps team is more than 3 people or 4 people.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So, and a lot of times you're an individual contributor of one. So you can't do everything for everybody and you can't assess everything and be predictable about everything. But what are those key levers and understanding what are those driving factors that, ultimately allow us to pull or not pull those levers, during the course of the year.
Yeah, I think that's well put. We're coming up on time here, so I want to finish up with kind of like your perspective on hiring. I think you've hired, I think 40 plus folks into the portfolio over the past few years. So I'm going to start with like your expectations based on a few like role types, and then get into like your assessment process and like how some people have stood out. But
Yeah.
maybe starting. A lot of people are very interested in how to make it to VP, and I don't think it's super clear what a VP of RevOps even is. So, like, what are your expectations for like a director level versus like a VP, if they're different?
Yeah. I think it's more so around the compensation and the role responsibility and the tenure. and really having people continue to advance in the career. So if I think about a director, I know there's probably some trade-offs between that director and those VPs. I might not get that full level of proactiveness. I might need more coaching and enablement. Working more, getting more direction from my CRO. I probably still would have a very tight handle on, go-to-market tech stack and tools and sales. It's those key concepts. But in terms of being able to drive and kind of really probably having more of a seat at that executive table.
Mm.
I think that's a little bit of where I see that difference between that director and VP level.
Okay, so proactivity, like level of support and mentorship, and then like level of kind of like thought
Yeah, I think the ability
partnership.
to really have executive conversation, I think, is a huge component of it. I think about the VPs across the portfolios and the VPs I've got to work with. You can put them in a board meeting and they can tell you everything you want to know. Where a director, they might be able to kind of give you the information versus really being able to tell the full story.
Yeah. How about for like a first RevOps hire at a company? I don't know if you've had examples of a portco that had like no RevOps at all, maybe like the foundation's not there. Like, what are you kind of looking for from a maybe background, roles and responsibilities standpoint on that front?
Yeah, it's a great. I've filled that job more than I would like to fill over the years, but it's somebody who's going to roll up their sleeves. And I think where I index very, very high on first revenue ops hires is having a high business IQ. You have to have that high business IQ of, because you're not going to have, how do we want to set up this or what does this look like? Like you're going to have to build that out and you're going to have to learn this business that you're being thrown into the deep end to
Mm.
very quickly. And to me, like the business IQ element is crucial, probably more so than any other aspect. When I'm looking at making that hire. The second is just a scrappiness. Really a willingness to roll up their sleeves. Because you're gonna have everybody coming to you for something, and you're gonna have all of these competing priorities, and not probably the help that you ultimately want. So, you have to have that grit and tenacity to say, like, this is what we're going to do, and be able to be strong and say, like, let's not let great get in the way of very good, and build that right foundation and have that tenacity to say, like, this is our plan. This is what we're going to go out there and execute. Um, so I would say those two skill sets are really, really important. A lot of times they're hard to find on the resume. So they definitely come out a lot more in the interview process. There's baseline of, understanding, KPIs and metrics and tech stack, but where I'd say the key differentiators are that business IQ and that tenacity.
And how do you get into assessing this in like the interview process?
Yeah, I go to very heavy scenario based questions. If you talk to probably the hundreds of people I've interviewed, the amount of time I spend on their resume is minuscule. I come to interviews prepared. I respect their time. I can read through their resume and get a very good handle of what they've done and in their previous roles. And but then I'm really talking, giving scenarios or talking through experiences or talking through challenges I've had and how they would have dealt with that and how they would think about this type of problem. And, I find that in those type of conversations, you get to see how well they communicate. They're not just reading through their resume, but you're also seeing like very quickly on the fly, which is, like how they would deal with situations. And to me, I've had a lot of great results with that. Um, and I think it's a much better interview process as well.
Yeah. How have people stood out to you? It sounds like, good communication skills and just kind of like chatting, being able to diagnose that scenario and problem solve on the fly might be the answer. But is there like a layer deeper on things that have really impressed you or a common theme and the folks that ultimately like got the job based on your kind of interview process?
I think it comes around the questions that they're asking in the process. And, they want to understand what they're potentially walking into. And I think that same type of approach is important when you're in that seat. So I would say like what stands out to me is, and it goes back to communication, but like just how they're approaching the interview and how do they come prepared and are they asking the right questions? And I'm not a lot of times like looking to see like, okay, do they have a list of 15 questions written down on a notepad? Like, but what was brought up during the conversation today? Hey, now you brought up this. What does that mean for this type of situation? Or like, how do you guys work with it? Like, and I think that's ultimately something I index very high on, and that really helps them to stand out in the process. And I think it really shows a lot more of who they are, and it puts them in their natural environment.
It feels like it's getting to that ownership piece too. Like they're already thinking ahead to like what they're gonna do and handle on the job is kind of like my read of that.
Yeah, completely agree. I probably never haven't thought about that as much, but as you say, I think that's ultimately where it gets to is they're ready to tackle they're illustrating an ability to tackle the problem and a
Yeah.
willingness to tackle the problem. And they're doing those things even now to help them own it and be successful in the long run.
Yeah. That's awesome. Makes a ton of sense. Well, cool, Drew. We're at time here. Anything I missed here around kind of like what good RevOps looks like, life and value creation, advice for folks generally, whether it's in executing RevOps or kind of getting into the field? Anything that I missed, or did we cover it all?
No, I think, I would just give a little piece of advice for the RevOps community. Like continue to, be proactive and, outreach with the network. I can't tell you how many great revenue operations leaders I've gotten to meet over the years and how willing they all are to help. And, like a lot of times very lonely in the trenches. And, like I think the network has been a huge help in keeping people excited about the field. And, it's just great to continue to see the innovation that everybody is, continuing to do in the industry.
Yeah, I think it's an awesome community for sure. It's fun to be around it. But Drew, thanks a lot for coming on. This is awesome. Really appreciate the time. I know you got a lot going on.
No, it's been awesome. Thanks so much, James. Appreciate you guys.